This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jay Coakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Sports and Society podcast. Your hosts are Jay Coakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. Hey, Jay.
Hi, Jeff. Good to be with you and our guests this morning.
We are up to episode 9 of season 2. This episode draws directly from chapter 2, Producing Knowledge About Sports and Society. In early editions of Sports and Society, Jay had used Michael Mesner's famous Barbie Girls vs. Sea Monsters article to illustrate the sophisticated research methodology Mike used to generate knowledge about gender dynamics in a specific youth sports context. In the current edition of Sports and Society, we updated that chapter with research that Michaela Musto did on youth swimming that builds upon Mesner's earlier research in Barbie Girls vs. Sea Monsters. I should add that Mike was Michaela's doctoral advisor, and, full disclosure, he was my doctoral advisor too. There are two central points that we want to address in this episode. First, how are theory and methods used to generate knowledge, and specifically feminist knowledge about the social world? And then second, how does one scholar build upon previous research to generate new knowledge of the social world? To answer these questions, Michael Mesner and Michaela Musto have joined us to talk about their research. Michael Mesner is Professor Emeritus of Sociology and Gender Studies at the University of Southern California. His research has contributed to the study of gender in sports, men's relationships with feminism, gender-based violence, and war and peace. He lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico with his wife, the world-famous sociologist Pierrette Hondanucitello. What makes someone seem like they are stronger, faster, smarter, or nicer than others? Why do people care more about certain talents and traits than others? To answer these questions, Michaela Musto, an assistant professor of sociology at Brown University, uses qualitative and quantitative methods to understand the social construction of exceptionalism. Focusing on settings that range from K-12 classrooms to professional sports, Musto's award-winning research identifies how institutional and interactional forces confer expertise to a select few. Rather than being inherently different from one another, Musto finds that people often become what situations allow them to be. And one of our favorite studies by Michaela focuses on the interaction among boys and girls on a swim club team in California. In this study, Michaela highlights the interaction patterns related to gender and how their coaches influence them. Michael and Michaela, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff and Jay, for having us, and what a pleasure to be on here simultaneously with Michaela.
Hi, Jeff and Jay. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here with everyone.
Yeah, this is awesome. This is a really exciting episode for both Jay and myself. So let's jump right in. And we have a couple of questions we ask everybody that comes on the episode. So, Michaela, why don't you go first? Can you describe your experience in sports?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up playing sports. I feel like when I was younger, my parents had to force me to do a lot of sports. I describe myself as being a bit more of an indoor kid, even to this day. But so I did a bit of everything. I had absolutely no hand-eye coordination, but I was decent at anything that required me to just run in a straight line or swim in a straight line or, move in back and forth, over and over, counting laps. Those types of things were a bit more in my wheelhouse. So I grew up swimming. And then when I was in high school, I got into rowing And then I continued rowing when I was in college at the University of Michigan.
Mike, how about you? Talk about your experience with sports.
Well, my experience with sports was several decades before Michaela's, but I think time period really matters. I think that, I was born in 1952, so I was a kid in the 50s and 60s. And my father was a high school basketball coach and a former college football player. So I was really raised with this idea that sports were just everything. And my friends and I would play football, basketball, baseball during various seasons. And then I got really focused in on being a basketball player. And I really admired, my friends and I admired, Willie Mays of the San Francisco Giants, Wilt Chamberlain, who then played for the San Francisco Warriors, and then all the local heroes, especially for me, the guys who played on my dad's basketball teams. And so I was really focused a lot on being a great basketball player, and I never became a great basketball player, but I tried really hard, and I think that was part of my sort of formative experience of having a little bit of a identity crash when I got into college and realized I wasn't really going to go much further as a competitive basketball player. But in retrospect, not long after that, when I got into college, I started realizing that all of those heroes that I had and all of the ways that I thought about sports for myself were very gendered, and that there really weren't any opportunities, for instance, for my two older sisters to play sports. They were older than me, and Title IX happened in 72, and I graduated high school in 70. They were in high school in the 60s. So if a girl wanted to do something publicly, it was be a cheerleader, and certainly no sports. So that kind of realization for me became an early spark for what I later studied as a sociologist, that growing up in an era where it was believed that only boys and men played sports, girls and women watched and cheered, generated a lot of interesting questions for me down the road.
Well, unsurprisingly, Mike, you more than anybody else inspires my second question, because you've kind of already answered it, which is how has your experience in sports influenced the questions you ask and the research that you conduct? And I think you have, across your career, done such an amazing job of connecting your own personal experiences to the scholarship that you do. And you've already started to address this, but I don't know if you would want to add any more to how those experiences you've had in sports influence the research that you've done, or maybe even talk about your very first book, Power at Play, which, by the way, did make it on the Rage Against the Machine reading list. And it's the only academic book on that list.
Oh, well, thank you for that plug. I think a lot of sociologists work from their personal experience to generate questions, whether we admit it or not. I mean, a lot of our concerns as sociologists originate in our daily lives and in our family lives and in our school days and so forth. And for me, I guess a part of my personal story that I didn't mention or didn't elaborate on too much is that when I got to college and I had this kind of identity crash, I kind of lost my footing for a bit, because I'd always defined myself as an athlete, and that was the basis of my identity. So when I got into graduate school, and a number of years later, and I was really becoming more and more interested in feminism and asking feminist questions about men, my advisor, Bob Blauner, said, you've had this really rich experience as a failed athlete, and you should probe that as a sociological question about men and masculinity. So as my dissertation and for my PhD, I did life history interviews with men who were former athletes, some who played through high school, some through college, some who were pros. And I really was interested in ways in which sports structured their identities as boys and men, the kind of costs that they paid for for adherence to these sort of narrow definitions of masculinity in terms of health and relationships, And then what happens at the end of a sports career, which, for athletes, their career ends at a pretty young age compared to most other careers. So I was really curious what happens to male identity and men's relationships after a sports career ends. And so that was my doctoral dissertation. And a few years later, I developed that into the book Power at Play that you mentioned, and that Rage Against the Machine apparently saw as a book worthy of putting at least the cover along with those by many more famous writers than myself.
How about for you, Michael? How did that experience of going up and back influence the kind of research that you're doing now and the questions that you ask?
Yeah, much like Mike, I happened into sociology because it allowed me to make sense. It gave me a framework to understand the things that I had seen, but just didn't quite have the words to explain. I happened to take a class when I was an undergrad. I think it was called like Sex, Sport, and Gender or something like that. And one of my teammates actually told me to take the class. She had, I think, taken it in like a prior year and said it was a great class. So myself and another former teammate, just took the class together. And having grown up, if at the time when I was playing sports, it was after what Mike was talking about. Title IX was already well into effect, but it was even in high school especially, it was very clear to me that there were structural differences in terms of the way that athletes who were both involved in boys sports, but also a very specific set of sports were treated in comparison to everybody else. So, I remember thinking, why do why do the boys have access to the gym, and like, why do they have access to the weight room in the afternoons? And why do we have to wake up at like 5 a.m, 3 days a week to go lift weights? Because that's the time that, the weight room happens to be open. Or why does our high school newspaper spend a lot more time talking about and writing about the accomplishments of like the football and the basketball team, and occasionally some of the tennis or the golf players, but like we're out here swimming and we're rowing and we're working really hard, but nobody's really paying that much attention to what we're doing. That same trend, I think, was even more amplified when I was an athlete in college. We all knew that some athletes had access to like special cafeterias where they got like extra food, and we often were outside rowing and it would be about 30 degrees, 40 degrees in the spring or the late fall, and we would like just barely have enough gear to stay warm, or like it would be raining and like my clothes would be like damp, and like I had to figure out how to dry my clothes like before practice several hours later. And there was other athletes who just had like tons and tons of gear and things like that. So I think seeing some of those experiences myself really then aligned with the sociological concepts that I started to learn when I took that first sociology class. And one of the very first things that we read in that class was actually Mike Messner's Barbie Girls versus Sea Monsters. So that is also then how I ended up first, like finding my interest in like studying, youth sport in particular.
So if I could just comment on that, I mean, it really strikes me that Michaela's story and my story are so indicative of just growing up in different moments and kind of coming of age and becoming conscious in different moments. And so my moment was really about how sports creates this very firm boundary between boys and girls and men and women, and it excludes girls and women almost entirely. And Michaela's story is a post-Title IX story, really is about, okay, now we have this structure set up where girls and women are officially included in sports, but what are all the various ways that sports is still being structured, sports coverage is still being structured, that create inequities and inclusion and exclusion? And that those become like super rich sociological questions as we move into the 80s and 90s.
And I'll just throw in there that Mike Messner has one of the most influential research projects on the coverage of men's and women's sports that y'all can look up if you're interested in that. Now, Yeah, this is incredible. The way in which you each describe your experiences in sports and how that influenced the research and scholarship that you're doing. Somebody once said to me, people become sociology majors because they want to understand themselves. And I think that's actually probably true for most people in most majors, but it's explicitly true, I think, for most people in sociology because of the nature that we do. Now, each of you have adopted a feminist perspective and a feminist set of values and politics, and that infuses all of the scholarship that you do. So I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about feminist sociology. What does that mean? Because not everyone listening to this episode is necessarily grounded in feminist scholarship. And Mike, you've been such and I stopped short of using the word seminal. Such an important voice in feminist sociology, which to some people might seem a little bit unusual still, that as a man, that you have been such an important voice in feminist sociology. So maybe you could start off just giving us a brief overview. When we talk about feminist sociology, what does that even mean in just very broad strokes?
Yeah, well, and thanks for the compliments. I think again, I'll kind of stay in this groove of thinking about different generational moments and cohorts. That for me, I was an undergraduate at the beginning of the 1970s, and I was really excited when I started to learn about sociological theory and starting to think about how theory can offer us these big, complex stories that help to explain not just ourselves as individuals, but history and our place in history and our place within society. But that was also a moment at the beginning of the 1970s when feminist sociologists were starting to criticize the limits of sociological research and theory. And I started to learn kind of right towards the end of my undergrad, and then as I went into graduate school, that most of those theories that I've been reading were kind of just like the athletes that I had worshipped as a kid. They were all men, and mostly they were all white men, and they were mostly all dead white men. And so, and it doesn't mean that their works weren't still important and interesting to read, I think. But there was a clear message coming from feminist sociologists that there was a sort of male bias or male standpoint that was built into the theories that we were reading and applying to generating research questions. So just as a quick, for instance, when I was a youngster and starting to learn sociology was kind of balkanized into different areas, and it still is in different ways. But two really important areas in sociology were sociology of work and occupations, and then sociology of the family. And sociology of work and occupations pretty much studied men's workplaces and men's struggles in workplaces and men's unions and so forth. And sociology of the family pretty much studied women. And it was one of the few subfields of sociology that did focus at all on women in families. And what feminists did was they said, look, you have to look at the ways in which work and family are connected. Don't separate them out as separate areas. And when you do that, you start to realize that what women are doing is work. If you want to study work and occupation, there actually are a lot of women in the workforce who are mostly working in lower wage occupations. And then there are women doing unpaid labor, caring for others, children, families, husbands, the kind of care work that women might be doing for their children in schools, volunteer work in schools and in sports, youth sports and so forth. So feminists suddenly pressed us to think of the things that women are doing, whether it's paid or unpaid, as work, and that merged our thinking about work and occupations and families. And now we ask very different questions, because of that. We ask questions about family leave policies and how that impacts workplaces and families. And so I think those kinds of insights were very, I will say, germinal for me rather than seminal. That they really germinated a lot of questions that I started to ask about sports, and so a lot of things about youth sports and volunteer coaching, and like, why is it that in this day and age still most adult volunteers who are youth sports coaches in soccer or Little League baseball, why is it that so many of them, the vast majority of them, are still men in this day and age? So those kinds of questions, feminist theory really kind of stimulated me to start asking those kinds of questions.
So, Michael, you did come up in a really different time, and now you are one of these younger scholars doing really cutting edge research. So for you, how do you explain feminist sociology to students? Like, what's your sort of mile high picture of this broad terrain?
Yeah, this is such a tough question. I think Mike did a fantastic job explaining it and gave a lot of the backstory that I try to, give a really concise version of when I'm teaching students. So I teach sociology of gender and sexualities classes to both undergrads and grad students here at Brown University. And some of the students who come into the class are interested in sociology. Some of them are interested in gender. Some of them are interested in sexuality. So there's a lot of these, it's a very productive tension, but, sociology and feminism aren't always the same thing. So I often feel like I'm speaking to 5 different audiences at once. But I actually think I want to back up a tiny little bit before I get too far into it, because, when Mike was talking about the way that we regardless of where you learn sociology from, there's, specific thinkers who are identified as being in, sort of, we often call it the canon, or there's scholars whose work is often seen as being really influential, and it's often read and cited, like broadly within sociology. And, in sociology, we often think about, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim as being, some of the big theorists that we all read and know and cite. But I always try to tell students, because, the thought of theory, or the word theory, can sometimes really scare people, and they don't want to think of themselves as being a theorist. But we all theorize in everyday life. In order to cross the street or to drive anywhere, we all are relying on generalizations about the world around us, which is pretty much what theory is. It's just a way of taking, a pattern that you observe and extracting or extrapolating from that to then understand something that applies to, more than just the exact situation that you're in. And so that's kind of a social theory. But then what sociologists do is we try to understand that in a more systematic way by looking at either more situations, more people, more countries, and also trying to make sure that we're not missing important variations in people's experiences. So, if we're thinking about people, is there a certain type of person whose experiences we're generalizing from? For example, Mike's example of work is a really good one, right? So the way that we might be defining work is most applicable to the experiences of men, and especially white, heterosexual, and cisgender, able-bodied men who are married. But then, we might want to think about, what changes about our theories if we think about work in these other ways? And I think that's where feminism really comes in, and allowing us to understand that, when we're thinking about society, we have to assume that society is very complex, and in order to understand it and explain our lives in a way that is meaningful and really captures the nuances in people's experiences, we have to think about how not just one thing, but a lot of things at once are all influencing our experiences. So gender, our assumptions that gender is a binary, that is something that is embedded within all levels of society. Our perceptions of race and racism are also, created and intertwined with gender and class. Age is also really important. Sexuality, I could keep going. So all of these things are all working together, and that's a concept that, in more, I guess, today it feels somewhat obvious to talk about intersectionality. It's a word that a lot of people, both inside higher education and outside of higher education now know. But that is a form of thought and like a way of viewing the world and theorizing that like emerged at a very particular instance of time. And as I was going through grad school and nowadays it's become, I won't say seminal, but it's become more taken for granted as like this is a way, we'll develop better theory if we're thinking about society in a really complex way that's acknowledging intersecting systems of inequality that are shaping all of our lives, just sometimes in different ways.
Yeah, and I think as I listen to both of you, one of the thoughts that comes to my mind, and we've used it in the book, but theory and methods are like a big map to get you from what we know now to producing new knowledge. And in the past, as Mike pointed out, there was one road to travel to get to the new knowledge, and it was limited in certain ways, although people didn't recognize that. Feminists then said, wait a minute, there's another road that we could take, and it will also lead to new knowledge. And for a while, they were doing their research and producing new knowledge separately from what the men were doing. Over time, the men started to realize, wait a minute, they've got all sorts of good things to say. So the roads started to merge. And after that merger occurred, there were other roads related to race and ethnicity and other ways of looking at research, at social theory and research methods. So there were other roads. And again, they existed by themselves for a while. And now they've started to merge. And we've ended up with this whole notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion guiding a lot of the work that's done in sociology right now. And I know that's a politically hot term, but without diversity, equity, and inclusion, you miss out on all sorts of new knowledge. And so that's an important point when we're talking about our material in chapter 2 on theory and methods.
Yeah, as we think about how feminist sociology opened up new lines of thought, I always go back to Mike, some of your research, like your research on men's violence. And when we think about men's violence from within a feminist perspective, I think a lot of people are thinking about how men engage in violence against women, which is an incredibly important topic. But you push beyond that to focus on men's violence against each other, and ultimately how that violence then comes back on men, and the multitude of ways in which men suffer. We suffer because of the way in which we don't reflect upon our gendered identities, the ways in which we were raised. For those of us that grew up in sports, that grew up in violent sports, I mean, I played football and rugby and boxed and, was trained to deliver violence on people, which meant I've had to sustain a lot of violence myself. And men have shorter lifespans, and we engage in much riskier behaviors, and we don't accept medical advice as quickly as women, and all of these things come with tremendous costs. And the research that you've done, the research Michael is doing now, I mean, that opens up our eyes to incredibly important things that just from the outside, if you're not familiar with this field, you just wouldn't know, right? That this is the knowledge, this is the useful knowledge being produced. But speaking of useful knowledge, I want to get us back to the to what we one of the things that we're talking about today, and that's that Barbie Girls versus Sea Monster article. I was hoping, Mike, you could talk a little bit about it. Perhaps you can start by telling us the story of how you came to do that research, and then outline the major arguments and the findings that you had in that article.
Sure. Let me just quickly respond to something you just said about violence too, though, because it connects to what we were saying about theory, that that connection between men's violence against women, men's violence against other men, and men's violence against our own selves, our own bodies, was really nicely theorized by Canadian political scientist Michael Kaufman, who wrote a very influential article years ago called The Triad of Men's Violence, and really kind of probed the connections between those three forms of violence. And I've used that idea to think about the triad of violence in men's sports. And it really gets at sort of the ways in which sports and the ways we've structured sports and the way we kind of structure boys and men into sports contributes oftentimes to men's negative or sexist views of women and actual acts of violence towards women, but also the sort of costs to men, both as recipients of other men's violence and in terms of injuries to our own bodies. So the Barbie Girls versus Sea Monsters piece, it's been really fun for me over the years, because that article is one thing that I've written that so many professors tell me that they've used in classes and that their students really resonate with. And I think it's partly because it speaks to a pretty common experience that people have had in youth sports, either as little children or as parents with children in youth sports. And unlike a lot of my other research, which, Michael mentioned a few minutes ago, kind of how we as sociologists try to do research systematically rather than just kind of anecdotally. Most of my research I've tried to do in a really systematic sort of way, but this article really was not based upon a planned research project. This was a moment in social life that was serendipitous. And it was when my younger son, Sasha, was experiencing his very first day of soccer. And it was a 4 and 5 year old team of boys called the Sea Monsters. And before his first game, which would have been later that afternoon, the community, this is South Pasadena, California, the community had a opening ceremony with all of the teams at the high school track, and all of the kids had to kind of stand around with their teams and their coaches and their team parents to wait for the beginning of what is just essentially a parade around the track with an announcer announcing them. But it was during this time beforehand, this sort of unstructured time beforehand, when my son's team, the Sea Monsters, is standing in one spot, and then right next to them, there's a little group of 4 and 5 year old girls who would call themselves the Barbie Girls, and they had a little red wagon that they were going to pull through the parade, and on it sat a very large Barbie doll. I mean, 3 or 4 feet tall. And the girls all started singing this Barbie song and parading around the Barbie doll in a very happy and ceremonious way. And I was just watching this, and then I watched the little boys, who then also became enthralled with watching the girls. And I could really, and to me, that was the most interesting part of it was how I could see on a couple of the boys' faces that they were really drawn to this joyful ceremony around the Barbie. You could almost feel them leaning into it. But then one of the boys started chanting, "No Barbie, no Barbie." And then all the other boys started kind of chanting into this "No Barbie," a kind of angry chant against the girls. And then it kind of devolved into the boys kind of running and invading the girls' space and trying to chase them. And the parents were all standing there watching, just delighted by all this. And it seemed to just prove for them, and some of them even said, "Look how different the boys and the girls are. They're so different." And so this for me was like a moment where I thought, this is a fascinating moment in everyday life. And I thought, I'm going to try to make sense of this. So I just asked the question of myself, how did this happen? And kind of try to use my sociological imagination to kind of go behind that moment. And so I did got home and wrote as thick a description as I could of what I just witnessed. But then I kind of dove into trying to understand how that moment could have happened and what it meant. And I used, different sociological theories, and the structure of this article really ends up kind of looking at it from 3 different theoretical perspectives and then tries to pull them all together. but the first being kind of an interactional perspective, which is an old sort of social interaction theory in sociology, but feminist sociologists had drawn from that to describe gender as something that we do. It's something that gender is an everyday accomplishment of group life. And so in this case, we could see the boys and the girls interacting with each other in ways that really constructed gender. And Michaela earlier mentioned how critical we are today of thinking about gender as a binary. And in this case, you can see how these interactions and the parents' responses to the interactions of the kids actually created a binary and made it seem like a natural division between two sexes. And of course, you can read in to sort of feel some tensions in there. Those boys that were really drawn to the moment, that might have been ready to jump in and dance with the girls, but immediately that dynamic was set up that divided and separated and created this group-based interaction where the boys and the girls were constituted as separate groups and oppositional groups. And then I looked at social structure. Like I asked the question, how could that interaction have happened? What was the context that made that interaction possible? And that was, in large part, that the 4 and 5-year-old kids are divided into boys and girls teams right off the top. And if they had been integrated into a boys and girls co-ed team, you can bet that the team names would have been different, that they wouldn't have had that kind of interaction. They'd have had something else really interesting might have happened, but it wouldn't have been that. It wouldn't have been boys with wearing one color uniform, girls with another colored uniform, kind of having these very different sorts of oppositional interactions with each other. And so I looked at that sort of structure and also the structure of leadership with the coaches, and that became a spark for a larger, much more systematic study later of youth sports coaches and gender. And then I also looked at the importance of cultural symbols, of the sort of richness of gender symbolism in our social lives. The Barbie doll being, the most potent symbol in this moment. What does a Barbie doll mean to girls? What does it mean to boys? What does it mean to parents? And there's a rich social and cultural studies literature on Barbie. That's very fun to dive into. And back then I dove into it, and it's continued, I think, beyond that. That was a couple of decades ago. But team colors, team names. I mean, why would a group of boys call themselves the Sea Monsters and the girls would call themselves the Barbie Girls? And how do those kind of team names, the colors, the girls were assigned pink. No boys teams were assigned pink. How are colors gendered? How are team names gendered? How are symbols like Barbie dolls gendered? And how do people take up those symbols and use them in everyday life? So interactions, using cultural symbols within a structured context, that's essentially the story and the analysis that I developed.
Yeah, that really ties into Michaela's research that's now a focus in our chapter on theory and methods, because Michaela used your research as kind of an inspiration, and then she built on it. And at that particular time that Michaela was doing the research, there were some mixed gender teams, and she found one in swimming, and ended up, in a sense, extending what you're saying right now, and looking at the interaction, the structure, and the culture within that swim team. And so, Michaela, how was your relationship with Mike and knowing his research influential in conceptualizing yours? And where did you go that goes beyond what Mike did? I mean, in a complementary way.
When I was listening to Mike talk about his, his experiences of observing and then, writing about the moment that he observed at the opening ceremony of the Youth Soccer League, I was thinking about another, just like a brief quote in that article, which I think about probably once or twice a month. One of the parents in, that Mike writes about in the article, I think like leaned over to him and said that, when I was in college, I learned that gender was a social construct, but, then I had my own kids. And then I realized that gender is, much more grounded in biology than we often give it credit for. And I think about that so much because in everyday life, professors, people that I, run into on the street, like everybody still says that, some variation of that. I hear it all the time. Um, and there's something about childhood and the way that childhood is structured that makes gender extremely salient. And it also seems like it's grounded in biology, and the gender binary feels like it's so, pervasive, partially because of the way that, childhood is structured. And so that question has always been one of the underlying questions that has, formed my own research questions. Another book that I read in this first class that I took when I was an undergrad was Barry Thorne's Gender Play. And this book had a lot about sport in it, even though it was an ethnographic study of, I think it was fourth and fifth grade students in 2 or 3 different elementary schools in California and Michigan. And one of the things that, both Mike Messner and Barry Thorne both emphasized in their books is that, what we believe is related to what we perceive. And interactions can be structured in ways that make things like gender, or race or class or age more salient. And then sometimes those moments where it seems like people are, extremely different from one another are the ones that we really notice and latch onto. And we don't spend as much time thinking about the instances where, gender, for example, is less salient and we are more alike than we are different. So when I was in grad school, I was really interested in studying, how our perceptions of gender are, negotiated in everyday life. And partially because I had grown up in swimming, I knew that, a lot of the literature had focused on sports where people are placed into sex segregated categories from the beginning. And I was interested in swimming because I knew that, even though swimming is not a completely, integrated sport, because people still compete in different events. There's different teams, especially when you're thinking at things like the high school or the college level, but especially in youth sport, there's often more instances where, people of different genders are practicing together or are, spending time, at a swim meet. There's a lot of downtime in between your races. So people are often just, spending time with other people. And I was curious to know how gender might have influenced, people's experiences in a sport that was different than some of the sports that often get focused on, both, in prior research, but also within, American culture more broadly. So, for example, football is a very different type of sport than a sport like swimming. So I think that was sort of the overarching question that guided my research. And the fun thing and also the really stressful thing about ethnography is that you always just get to feel like you are out of place all the time, because you often, if people are if you're fortunate enough to have people who will let you do research with them, you're often kind of hanging around and you don't always have a formal role. Sometimes you do, but I was fortunate enough that there was a swim team in Los Angeles that was willing to let me, come and observe practices a couple times a week. And I just so happened to focus on the, I think it was like the 9 and 10-year-olds. And I think their name was I forgot. I think I know, I don't want to say it off the top of my head because now I'm worried that I forget what the pseudonym was in the article, but they were seen as being like the most elite swimmers within their age group. And, this was, just by chance, there was more girls than boys in this age group. And the practices were structured in a way that it was really clear to the swimmers that, gender wasn't necessarily the best predictor of someone's abilities. The fastest person in their training group just so happened to be a girl. And the article was designed to show that, moments like this don't happen every day. We don't always see this. Most of the time you might not have this exact, you might not see this exact same thing if you happen to go to any other, swim team at random. But judging, if we use this, how can we sort of identify what might make it more possible for us to develop different beliefs about gender, where we're more able to see the variability in people's experiences, and recognize that a lot of the times there's more similarities than there are differences between us.
It's incredible. There's a line in that article, Michaela, that also resonates with me, and I repeat it in my classes all the time, where in that specific incident that you're referring to in the article, Mike writes that there's this like feminist saying that believing is seeing. It inverts the common truism of seeing is believing, that if we believe something, those things jump out to us when they happen in the world. And it's like, and it proves what we already believe. Right. And so that's so useful. And perhaps, Mike, you got that from Barry Thorne. I'm not sure. I know you got that from somebody else. And so you got this little line from somebody, you put it into your research, that opens up a way of seeing for somebody like Michaela. And now, Michaela, you're generating new knowledge based on that, but you're also telling a different story than Mike was telling. And how do you, as a scholar, draw on somebody else to tell a new story? Like how are you concretely, and that's what we do as scholars. So how do you think about that when you are writing, when you are researching and analyzing and writing up your findings?
Yeah, and just to go back to what you were saying, the Believing is Seeing is a title of a great article. I think it was published in 1990 in Gender and Society, but it's written by Judith Lorber. And, she talks in that article about sport and how sport is this institution that plays a really important role in shaping what we see and therefore what we end up believing. But, in addition to that article, also when I was an undergrad, I read a lot of stuff that it would probably fall under the category of ethnomethodology, which is a really big word for, basically describing like how are our perceptions shaped by society. So we end up in a situation where, because society exists before us, it exists before we're born, that we're given categories and, ways of seeing the world. And then, those categories then inform the way that we understand our experiences. But of course, they're not deterministic. And that's often one of the great things about qualitative research, is that you can capture a lot of like the nuance and, the variability that, and this is something I learned from Mike, right? And from a lot of Mike's work, is that, we can often, and this also gets back to your question, Jeff, because one of the ways that, sociological research and ideas can move forward is by figuring out, what have other people said? And then what am I finding that's different? And when I teach students, undergrads or grad students, when they're trying to do research, much like what Mike said earlier, I often encourage them to think from their own experiences, because oftentimes that's a really good way of figuring out what other people missed before us. So, maybe you might be reading my article about youth sports, and you might think, well, okay, maybe partially like what you saw was because there was only, I think it's like 8 or 9 boys and like 14 or 15 girls that were like in this group. So what would you find differently if there was potentially like more boys than girls on a setting? Or what if I had studied like the younger swimmers or the older swimmers? Or what if I had studied the swimmers that were the same age but weren't seen as being like as elite or, as like intensive athletes as the rest, and these are all things that maybe from your own experiences, you have a hunch that might matter for some reason. Maybe if people are, less focused on swimming, or if it's just sort of this like fun activity that they do, you wouldn't have people as willing to follow their coach's instructions because they're more interested in just like having a good time. And maybe that would then allow us to see something different. So that's often how we end up generating a hypothesis that's informed by existing research that then allows us to figure out like, okay, well, this is a question that you have. And so how can you go about studying this? There's different methods that we use. Not everybody uses ethnography, but sometimes if you're interested in studying interactions, or if you want to understand how these meanings might shift or change in everyday life, or if you want to understand like the way that a group really matters, then ethnography is a really great lens for understanding that. Because, sometimes when you might be at home in your room, and maybe you're on Instagram and you're like, or you're on TikTok, and everything that someone says to you like really resonates, or like you're reading about something online and you're like, yeah, this makes a ton of sense. But then when you get into a classroom, then suddenly like the way that people are talking about is different than how you're talking about it. So sometimes what we believe isn't always the same as what we end up saying in a different setting or doing in our everyday lives. So that disconnect, I think, between like what people believe and what they do, and also looking at how people act differently in different settings, I think is often where really good new sociological knowledge is formed. And that's not just in comparison to like looking at what one or two people might do in their everyday lives, but it's also like what other researchers, thought was happening. And then you might see something that's different, and then explaining why that happens is often how knowledge ends up moving forward.
And I just wanted to add something to what Michaela was saying there, which is that, first is just to sort of identify that when Michaela wrote that article on youth swimmers, she was still a graduate student, and that article won an award from the American Sociological Association. And I remember being at the reception when Michaela got that award, and when Michaela, when you walked back to our table, we gave each other a little fist bump. But the person who introduced the award and you said this article is kind of written by Michaela Musto, but it's kind of Barry Thorne meets Michael Messner. And when you came back and spoke to me at the table afterwards, I said, that was kind of cool. And you said, no, not really. I really wanted it to be just Michaela Musto. It's like, and we all want like our work to be like really like this original contribution. But we all do kind of stand on other people's shoulders and build on each other's ideas. But I think that compared with my Barbie Girls piece, what your piece really uniquely contributed was like my piece was really like, here's what kids are doing in this one moment, in this one context. And what your piece showed was that gender was really working differently in two different contexts right next to each other. In the pool, the kids as athletes were more egalitarian with each other. And on the deck, when they're kind of resting in free time, there's more of a gender division operating there that the kids are kind of creating. And that whole idea of context is something that I've often tried to get my students to think about really carefully. And just on a personal experience basis, we all move through different contexts every day. We're in our family context. We're in our school context. We go to the store. That's a different context. We're in our sports. That's another context. We might go to some house of worship, and that's a different context. And every context has different kind of gendered or social organization or rules or informal sorts of structures. And so all of us are experiencing gender in very different ways throughout the day. And I think your piece really shows that and kind of opens a door for us to ask a lot more questions about social contexts.
Yeah, and one of the things I just want to add to that is that the coach was very crucial in creating that context in the pool, because she made it very clear that she was not making distinctions between the boys and girls in terms of gender, in terms of her expectations for performance, in terms of the meaning of gender, and in terms of how gender was not being integrated into her coaching. And that led Michaela to a conclusion that has stuck with me for a long time. How can a leader in a particular context contribute to gender equity by, like the coach did, very tactfully and not making any criticism of either the boys or the girls, but creating a context within which there was equity. And we saw how the boys and girls reverted to gender exclusive groups when they didn't have the coach around. So, you raise really interesting questions there when it comes to achieving equity. And I wonder what you're thinking now, since you've done the study and looked at some other settings, about that little potential hypothesis that you put at the end of your article.
Yeah. So after I did this study, I'm really interested in figuring out how, knowing that, people can hold sometimes contradictory beliefs about gender, right? So on the one hand, we can think that gender doesn't matter all that much. Just for example, when you're doing something like, training every day at swim practice. But on the other hand, it can really matter a lot when you're doing something like hanging out with your friends, like on the pool deck. So with that in mind, I wanted to know more about this, but there's not that many, youth sports that are, gender integrated. So I ended up switching to studying schools for my dissertation. And I wanted to know, for example, how does someone's experiences in math class, relate or not relate to what might happen in a sport like or a context like PE? If like, are these things related? If so, how? And, because all of these, a lot of the meanings that we're giving to our everyday lives and the ways that we're evaluating ourselves are related to the ways that we like, the ways that other people perceive our abilities in everyday life. And, one thing that it's also related to some of Mike's other work about the importance of coaches in particular. And I think, if I'm thinking about the difference between school and like, a youth sport where everybody is really excited to be there and, really wants to be there, there's like a huge difference. I think when I first started doing research at the middle school, I was just surprised at how much less buy-in educators, the majority of whom were white women, had on an everyday basis in comparison to another, relatively similar aged white woman who was a coach. And, where the coach had a much easier time commanding the kids' attention. And, she had a lot of buy-in from the swimmers and they all respected and listened to her. I saw something very different in schools. And, boys in particular in school settings were much more likely to ignore or undermine or challenge their teacher's authority. And, as the longer that I've spent both in grad school and then as a professor, I really do think that, part of the, sports could potentially play a really important role in changing the ways that we think about gender, especially when we're growing up, because, as some of Mike's other research has shown, a lot of boys never have a coach who is a woman or someone who's non-binary. It's mostly, cis and straight men who coach, boys and men's sports. And I think that that's a really important piece of how we end up thinking about men, and especially white men, as, being the people who are, really can command a space or who have a lot of authority and ability to give directions that other people will follow. So, that wasn't necessarily the intention of my first research project. But if I'm thinking back about some of the other studies that I've done since then, and if we also think about, who the majority of men's coaches are, especially at high levels, or who owns like a lot of the professional men's sports teams, the fact that white men are often in positions of power and authority in sport plays a really crucial role in shaping the ways that, like, when we think about like who has like status or who should lead, like those assumptions are very intertwined with one another.
So that really sets up a follow-up question I have for you, Michael, based on the knowledge you've generated and how that knowledge is useful and can be applied in real life settings. And I'm thinking about students that might be taking a sport class where they're assigned sports and society, and they may find this discussion more or less interesting, but they're wondering, how does it apply to me? I want to go out and I want to get a job in sports. Maybe they're a sport management student. Maybe they're a phys ed student, and they're just taking this class. And so can you talk about how this knowledge you've generated is in fact useful in real life settings for people that are going to go into sports work, right? Maybe they're going to work for an organization, uh, a higher level organization. Maybe they're going to work in a school. Maybe they're going to work in a municipal setting. In any of those kinds of settings, how is this knowledge really useful for them to have?
Yeah, and that I think is a really great question. And it's one of the really important things about sociology is thinking about, sure, we can write all these studies and they can be read by other academics, but like, are they useful in real life, or how might they actually help us, change society in ways that hopefully are better? And I think and one of the hard things about this article, and the reason why I try to be careful when I talk about it, is because a lot of people read it and then they say, well, yeah, you found this, but like, that's not how most sports are. And so, qualitative research, we write about, like, circumstances, and we can generate theory from them, but that's not the same as what you might do if you sampled a large group of people and came up with like a number, right? So I'm not trying to say, for example, that like 35% of youth swim teams would have this exact same dynamic. Like that would require a different type of method, and one that uses like a quantitative form of knowledge, and like a qualitative, you have to use like numbers to try to figure that out. But what my research can tell us is, here is a way that we could, there's some ways that um, we could try to change like the settings that we're in to try to have different forms of interactions to emerge. So, I think one of the things that's really important is just, do people have opportunities to interact with people who are different from them in everyday life? And this applies to gender, but it's also broader than that, right? Most of the, if we're thinking about college or like our jobs, there's a lot of, racial and class, and, to varying extents, gender and sexual similarities among people who end up within different types of settings. But, like sports, and I think one of the reasons why sports are so important to so many people is because they do often, it's potentially an opportunity to interact with people who are in different jobs than us, who, go to different schools than us, who live in different neighborhoods. So I think like one thing is just, first of all, like, is there opportunity for people to interact with people who are different than them? And then what activities are people going to be doing in those spaces? If we, like, for example, if let's say you were organizing like an adult, like sport team, right? Like a recreational sport league. If you choose to do a sport like football or basketball, it's going to draw a particular type of people who probably already have, prior experience in that sport, but maybe there's a way of like choosing, like, come up with a new sport, right? When I was doing research at the middle school, one of the activities that had the most buy-in from students during PE class was this game called, I think it was like Chicken Run. And they had like some rubber chickens and they like ran around the field, like carrying chickens around in their hands. And I'm not even quite sure what the point of the game was. But because the game had a different set of rules and it was a new game that didn't have the same expectations, there was much more enthusiasm from a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily have been as engaged during a sport like soccer or like tennis or football. So sometimes like coming up with new activities that people don't have pre-existing expectations about how they're going to do at it and how others are going to do at it can be a really great way of allowing people to both like present themselves in a new way to others, but also like, challenge their pre-existing expectations. But, it also has to be things that people want to do. Part of the reason why the swim team worked and why I saw what I saw was because all of the the swimmers really wanted to be there. They all really enjoyed swimming, and it was something that they were really serious about and committed to. And if we're thinking through other experiences that young people have, sports are one of the only opportunities where they really find that like passion. The same also goes for like a lot of other hobbies, right? So like musical instruments, or like if you're taking art classes, or if you're doing musical theater, these things are often much more exciting and like memorable to students than potentially what they're learning in like a math class, or even if we're thinking about like what happens in PE classes. But so I think like making sure that experiences matter and feel like real and important to people, especially when they're young, is like really it's a good way of making sure that we get buy-in, and that people are in a situation where they will then like there's more like opportunities to like respect people if they really want to be there and find a lot of value in what they're doing.
Yeah, Michaela, I know we're heading towards the end of our time here, but I've tried to create a list of the gender integrated new sports, spike ball and relays and in some cases volleyball. And so, there's a list of those, and I wonder if some of the students listening could expand on that list. And if you do, send it to us through the Discord server that Jeff will talk about in a minute. But I think to give Mike kind of the last word here, in a sense, you've done this research now for decades, and you have seen its impact, and you've seen resistance to its impact. And I'm wondering, how do you see the importance of feminist knowledge development within society as a whole? And do you feel that it has met your expectations for hoping for change, or has it fallen short? And, that gets into politics too. But what do you think there, Mike?
Well, mostly not too happy with the level and speed of social change. But I think, some of the research, Jeff mentioned earlier that I've conducted with Margaret Duncan and Cheryl Cookie, and Michaela has now been involved in this sports media research as well. Some of this analysis of the sort of televised coverage of women's and men's sports has certainly made its way into public discussions. The Women's Sports Foundation has used it. It's been used in journalism classes in universities. So I'm pretty happy with the ways in which some of that sports media research has had a public impact. And I think I'd like to think that it's helping to expand what we're seeing now. What we've seen recently. I mean, I've been a longtime fan of women's college basketball, and it's only the last few years that I'm really able to watch that very much on television. And it's such a joy to be able to watch it on TV and see really good quality commentators and good production values. So there's been some really substantial sorts of changes. I'd like to see also kind of thinking back to, Michaela mentioned respect. And I think that one of the things that I think boys especially need to learn is to respect others who are not cisgender males, and respect girls and women, respect queer people, trans people. And sports has too much in the past been a place where that kind of exclusive organization of boys led by cisgender men becomes a way in a context in which kind of disrespect of others is learned and celebrated. So I think one way that as people move into out of college into adulthood, one of the most common forms of sport participation for young adults and middle-aged adults is youth sports, either as a volunteer working in youth sports or oftentimes as a parent with youth sports. And one way that some of our research, I think, can be used, Michaela's research, my research, can be used by people as a sort of sensitizing experience for thinking, coming up with new questions, but also really concretely supporting women coaches, the development of women coaches, and the day-to-day sort of support for women coaches. Because what you find is that even when adult women are coaching girls' teams, they're subjected to a lot of special critical scrutiny that men coaches are not. Even men who don't have much sports background are really not scrutinized in the same ways that women who have a lot of sports background are scrutinized when they take up coaching a soccer team or a little league or a baseball or softball team. So I think just actively supporting that kind of inclusion is not just good for women and families, but it's good especially for kids to see a wide range of leadership of different races and ethnicities, of different sexualities in youth sports. So there are things that people can do to draw from the research that we've done that are very simple, everyday kinds of things. Just recognize inequities when you see them, recognize patterns. I mean, why is it that my kids' youth soccer league that 90% of the coaches are men and close to 100% of the boys' coaches are men? Why is that? How does that happen? Why hasn't that changed since 1972? So we can ask those questions and then, do something concretely on a very informal basis, just to be supportive of women coaches. And then maybe sometimes it involves having to take some kind of public stand if you get the sense that women coaches are being forced out or pushed out, which is some of the things that I found in my research.
I just want to comment really briefly because we got to wrap up here. But a concrete example of, I think, what both of you are talking about, and I'm specifically responding to you, Mike. But I think one of the things I especially take from Michaela's research is she's drawing attention to the fact that as a sport leader, you have the ability to impact the institutional structure that your athletes, whether they're youth athletes, they're senior athletes, wherever they are in the life course, you can concretely adjust that institutional context. And that then changes how people experience those sports. It opens up new opportunities. It might discourage some of the older patterns. It's the thinking through about how interactions happen in those spaces. So I'm just thinking about, my kids grew up playing flag football and I coached them. And a lot of them, it was almost all dads coaching. And a lot of the dads were really bad coaches, specifically because of their experience playing football. I didn't do organized youth sports. My training in coaching was from a football coach who played college football in the 1950s and the very draconian style of coaching. And I very quickly realized it wasn't a very effective way of working with the kids. So my son, and this is my very biased opinion as his coach and his father, my older son, he was the best player in our entire league. And then he aged out and became a ref. Well, he quit after 2 seasons of reffing because he couldn't take the middle-aged men screaming at him and disagree. And I'm talking about for young kids, 5, 6, 7-year-old kids games. This is flag football in the park with little children. And they were screaming at a 16-year-old. And in his response, in his head, he didn't say this to them because they were scary, was, you can't do what I do. You don't know this game as well as me, and yet you're going to yell at me and you're going to yell at your kids. If that league was more active in recruiting moms to coach as well as dads, the quality of play would have gone up. The experience that the kids had would have been more positive, and the experience that the teenage refs had would have been more positive. And these are simple things that a person can learn from reading Michaela's research, from reading your research.
And just to jump in and build on that, because I think it's such a great example of the importance of also taking young people seriously. Because the older you get, as adults, we often assume that we know better or things happen the way they are because that's the way it should be, right? We had to go through these things, right? Like, if you're playing football, you had to suffer, you had to, play through the pain. So that's how other people should do it too. But oftentimes, young people have a much better view of society because, they haven't spent as much time in some of these structures. So to them, it's often very clear what's wrong, but we just don't always listen to them. So I think the example of your son, Jeff, is a really good example of, part of the problem is also the fact that old people think that we know better than younger people. And sometimes what we also need to do is listen to younger people and potentially let them give ideas, and we should take those ideas seriously.
Oh, don't even get me started about what the Oklahoma drill does to children. All right. Well, we do need to end. We have exceeded our time. Michaela, thank you so much for giving your time, your knowledge, for sharing all of that. We've got more exciting podcasts coming, so keep an eye out for our new podcast. And what do you think about all of these topics? This discussion that we've had. We have a jump on our Discord server, as Jay mentioned. We've got a Discord server that you can join in on the conversations. There's a link in the description to this podcast episode for you to join the Discord. All right. Thank you very much, and we will talk to you again on our next episode.